let me take a little bit of time to just give my personal testimony a little more directly so that you can understand why I feel so strongly about this stuff. Basically, as a guy that asked Jesus into his life at 4, and I believe at that point a transformational beginning actually occurred, that I was converted, Jesus as Savior, if you want to use that terminology, but the Lordship of God, which should be integrated into salvation, was separate in my case because I did not understand the Lordship until I was in my early 20s, and that happened within the context of my time playing at Pacific Lutheran University, where I worked out my salvation with fear and trembling with other guys like me in that football context who loved God. They really did, loved to play, in this case football, wanted to glorify Him, didn't really know exactly what that looked like other than outcomes as compared to process, which is what we really want to highlight, obviously, in this course. They wanted to make memories in life and through sports. My teammates and myself, this is the community I came into, and we also wanted to do it straight, meaning we were not interested in drugs, we weren't interested in alcohol, we weren't interested in some of the things that were part of the culture at that time, far much more so now, 40 years later, but at that time they were still there also. And these were our interests and our non-interests. And in that kind of place that Frosty oversaw as the head coach, the integration of sport and faith, which had been birthed through the Handbook on Athletic Perfection by Wes Neal, had a chance to germinate within this culture that Frosty created, where people could work out their salvation with fear and trembling and integrate sport and faith, because he himself had already processed out what that looked like. Of course, he was a lifelong learner himself, and so every year he was maturing in his articulation and additional metaphors. Part of his genius was that he could bring it into super practical terms, what were biblical principles that he didn't necessarily allude to, but they were biblical at the time we saw them, and more so in retrospect, that he was really given a picture of what it looked like to live and play and coach biblically. And let me walk you through this process for you. So I'm converted at 4. I grew up in a conservative background spiritually. I'm walking with God as best I can under the umbrella of the local church and a family line that confessed Jesus, where I was living in Northern California. My youth experiences, I don't remember having any bad coaches that made it a bad experience. I played all sports as kids tended to do back then, when there wasn't year-round sports that you had to pick and choose. So you played basketball, and you played football, and you played baseball, and you might do some other things on the side. Soccer was not part of the reality in the 60s. For kids, wasn't even an option out there for us. Otherwise, I don't know how that would have fit in the equation. But it would have been something I did instead of something else. I have no idea. But those were the sports that I was involved in, and I played them all the way through 8th grade, all of them. And then I got a little more specific. I stopped playing basketball. I only played 1 year in high school, but I played all 4 years of football and baseball, and played in summer baseball and camps and all that stuff. Right? That was my world. And I had no idea how to integrate it. I wouldn't even have thought about that concept. I wouldn't even have thought about addressing that concept because it was never talked about. And the coaches I had, most of whom weren't godly, or they weren't attempting to use sport. They may or may not have been Jesus guys. I have no idea. Looking back now, some of them might have been closet Christians where they went on Sunday and it was compartmentalized. I did have a few that were, I'm saying from my high school years below, that were God-fearing at least, or Jesus-driven, but I never remember a conversation or any attempt to integrate. I do remember going to a Billy Graham crusade when I was 12, and a guy named Joe Orduña, who was a running back, I believe at Nebraska, he gave his testimony because he was a notorious national athlete, and it wasn't unfamiliar for Billy Graham to bring athletes up or other people that had some notoriety who were converted and could share their testimony of Jesus. And so that still went on back then, not at all like now, but it did go on back then, and I was aware of that stuff, and I loved God, and I was serious about Him, and I wanted to be good in sports. Unfortunately, I was driven by my own self-absorption and had not even addressed even the process of moving from self-absorption to death of self. That wasn't even on the table. I don't even remember addressing that. This is critical, even in the School of Sports Ministry, because at some point, until you know who you are in Jesus, and until you know your identity in Jesus, it's difficult for you to play that out in terms of the world. In the horizontal, we talk about that. Vertical is between God and man. Horizontal is with people. Obviously, there's unbelievers and there are believers. And I had no concept of any of that stuff being affiliated or integrated with sport. And it wasn't, again, until my late teens when the handbook at least taught me vertically how to think about sport and integrating it in terms of my practice and my preparation and my play and my approach. That didn't happen, as I said in a previous segment, didn't happen through outside intervention. It happened through a book and the Holy Spirit using the book and teaching me some stuff through a book that I began to practice. And then found a few people that had heard about it or were also, as Jesus confessors, attempting to work out their play. At that point, I wasn't coaching, of course, their play with fear and trembling. So I go through then, I come into a college setting, and unique stories. I coached 3 years of high school football before I started playing college football. Football then, from that point on, was my focus. Basketball and baseball were just things I did recreationally on the side. And as a football guy, so to speak, my freshman, sophomore, junior years of going to college, I did not play college football. I coached high school football. I won't get into that. This is not about me and my testimony. I'm just saying, through that frame of reference, I was still working this out myself without having any known mentors or people to look at or people to talk into my life. Of course, I read books by Christian athletes and coaches and things like that, but it was all just self-driven, which means that's problematic because I'd never been to the places I needed to go to really integrate my sport and faith at the deepest level. But West Neal was important to me, and the handbook was important to me. And then through a series of events, I started playing college football my 4th year in college at a school in California called University Pacific, and played there 1 season and transferred at Christmas to Pacific Lutheran University under the tutelage of Frosty Westering, who I had met, him and a number of his players and some of his coaches in the previous 3 years of college through camps of the Fellowship of Christian Athletes. So the Fellowship of Christian Athletes is an international organization that attempts to integrate sport and faith. And I had gone to a camp when I was a high school kid and then went to camps as a college kid. And when you're college kids, then you're kind of the overseer or you're the huddle leader or the leader of high school or junior high kids. And so I did that, I think, 5 different times or more, at least 5, when I was in college. So I met some of these Pacific Lutheran players, and I met Frosty Westering. And so when the time came that I felt I needed to transfer from my situation in California to Washington State, I ended up transferring to Pacific Lutheran University. And I, in the goodness of God, fell under the tutelage of a guy who I now 40 plus years later would say has the most unique take by far on the integration of sport and faith than anybody I've ever met or read about in my life. Now, I consider myself and want to be a lifelong learner, and I continue to pursue anybody through print or through testimony or through actual relationship who has any interest in the integration of sport and faith and what it looks like to be a legitimate Jesus follower tied to athletics, whether as a player, a coach, a fan, or support, or whatever you'd want to call that. And in the goodness of God, I fell into a guy, Wes Neal, that wrote the benchmark book on the integration of sport and faith, and I fell into a guy, Frosty Westering, who was practicing in it in the actual play and coaching level at the college level in ways that I'd never seen or heard of before or frankly since. And part of the, for me, humbling aspect of this is somehow I ran into a book and a guy, and somehow I ran into a coach and a teacher and a mentor who, in my experience now 45 years later, are the best I know in the business. And I happen to fall under both of them, which is freakily humbling for me that in the goodness of God that I ended up meeting them in these early stages of my life and my sport play, obviously not as a youth, as a elementary school guy, but by high school and college in this germinating window two people that still to this day I see as the benchmark articulators of what the School of Sports Ministry at FIU is going to be about. They ended up being the circle that I was invited into. It was the freakishness, possibilities of that are freakish. The fascinating deal is that Wes and Frosty knew each other. The fascinating deal is they came from the same core thought. And the fascinating deal is that Frosty was using Wes Neal's book. And Wes Neal had put out a handbook, but he also had a little teaser book called Total Release Performance. And that booklet was used and sent out to whoever wanted it. And somehow or another, Frosty ran into it. So in my first football experience at Pacific Lutheran, one of the handouts that he gave us was Wes Neal's, not the handbook, but the booklet, the Total Release Performance booklet was handed out to every player. As long as I played there or coached there, every year, every player ended up with this little teaser, I call it, of the Handbook on Athletic Perfection that Wes Neal had written. And it was fascinating to me, much more now than then, because I didn't understand the scope of who these guys were. All I knew that I read this book by this guy, but I didn't understand the impact, transformational impact it had on my life and on sport in this country and around the world. And this was what I ran into as a teenager. And then I ran into a school not realizing that this philosophy that I got invited to play under and then invited to coach under was, in my experience, again, this is just my experience, the most transformational sport experience as a player or as a coach that I've ever heard of or seen of. That doesn't mean it's better than others. That just means for me, I've not seen in fact, I've not seen anything that even comes close to the transformational impact of the Handbook of Athletic Perfection as a driver of the beginning thoughts about Jesus wanting to climb into our life and play and coach through us and be fanned through us, or I should say as an outsider, somebody in the outside circle that's not playing or coaching, and the outside circle, those people that observe sport, that watch it, support it, have kids in it, or just are fans of professional or college or high school athletics, they're also part of this circle. And Wes Neal, for me, is the leader in the articulation, and Frosty, for me, and thus our school, is the leader of the articulation of what this looks like, as we say, on the grass, or on the court, or on the mat, or the fields of play. And so this school is driven by those two guys. And I am a byproduct, I am a son of those two guys. And because I'm directing the school, this frame of reference, this articulation is going to come through me, through those guys, and then other people that have been impacted by those guys are also going to teach classes and provide other articulations within distinct courses under the School of Sports Ministry that are going to have some tie to those two guys. That's the frame of reference, that's the background. I can't even communicate the impact that Frosty for sure and Wes as the wedding day for me that they have had on my life. So my transformation as a Jesus follower occurred in this window of years, in particular when I was playing there, and then only had a chance to accelerate or multiply on the decade off and on that I was coaching under him. Sometimes in isolated years and once in a 5-year sequence. And so in a sense, they're my spiritual fathers in relationship to the integration of sport and faith. And all that we're going to talk about in the rest of this course, in this class on competing biblically, is going to be driven through them and then our own experience since then. We stand on the shoulders of others, and we may stand on their shoulders for an actual interaction that might be very brief or it may be elongated. But when it's transformational, that day, week, month, year, or decade that we're under people, so to speak, that we're standing on their shoulders and under their oversight or their instruction translates then into, as long as we live, decades of impact that can reproduce and multiply if we have a vision for that. And that's why the School of Sport Ministry and the School of Discipleship are also integrated here at Faith International University and Seminary, because all of that happens simultaneously within the context of sport and faith and life and everything else that it touches.